All right. Hello, hello. Hopefully you have some energy left after these three awesome presentations. I will be the last one, and my name is Jerry. I will tell you about the evolution of Python at Wolt and also give some tips for developing Python at scale. Before we start, a couple of words about me. So I'm a software engineer and a Python competence lead here at Wolt. I've been working for Wolt for around 2 years. And if I'm not coding, I'm usually playing frisbee golf. So you can easily spot me in the frisbee golf courses, especially in the Helsinki area. All right, let's go. So first, I'm going to give you a short history overview about how we use Python at Wolt and how we have been using Python at Wolt. We'll look the history from different angles, and the first one will be from the people developing Python perspective. So we're not that old company. We started around 2014, and I would say that from the Python perspective, it was two fearless developers with a great idea and a maybe Flask tutorial. This is just my hunch. But nowadays, we are more or less 80 people who use Python actively. I think one of the reasons why Python is so widely used here is indeed the fact that the founder started with Python and Flask. And actually the same Flask app is still kind of in the core of our multi-service humongous backend. So legacy still lives strongly. And just to note, the number 80 is not the amount of engineers that we have. It's just the people who use Python for one way or the other. But yeah, Python is definitely the biggest community that we have here inside Wolt. And I would say that it's pretty strong internal community. We have plenty of different kinds of knowledge sharing things going on. For example, some workshops and trainings as such. All right, that's about the people or the amount of people. And then about the language itself. Well, I guess hopefully every company that has started with 2 point something has already made the exercise to upgrade to 3 point something. And we did that during 2018. This was actually before I joined, so I have had the luxury to use the greatest and latest basically all the time I've been here. Nowadays, we basically go for the latest one quite soon after the release. And this is very rewarding from the developer perspective that you don't need to wait for the cool new language features to be at your hands. And then I wanted to highlight that from the language evolution perspective, type hints are playing kind of key role for us. So we are very into type hints and getting all the benefits that they bring. But maybe more about that later during the presentation. Then if we dive a bit deeper, we have plenty of services, and yeah, I already mentioned Flask. That's of course a big thing also nowadays. But like Larissa mentioned, Fast API is coming, and I think it's kind of the de facto nowadays. But since we only started trying it out 2019, you can imagine that there's plenty of things have happened between 2014 and 2019. So we have a bunch of Flask plugins for internal use. For example, all sorts of authentication related plugins. And then we have also tried G-Event with Flask for some high traffic, IO heavy endpoints. And that was around the time when we kind of were considering should we migrate to Fast API or try something out with the existing Flask implementation. And that has worked quite well. And I don't think there's any need for like just migrate for the sake of migration if there's no real reason behind that. And then just to mention, gRPC might be one of the next big things. Motivation behind that is that you usually get the automatically generated code for both server and client side, which is very, very handy. Of course, you could get this out of some open API specs, but I think the tooling is not that tightly coupled with the kind of schema specifications and such. So I think gRPC is playing good there. And I think this is also a trend on a wider perspective, if I have interpreted like recent blog posts from big companies correctly. So gRPC might be coming. That's about the frameworks. And then if we dive a bit deeper, libraries. So this is, of course, not all the libraries that we use. I just want to take a couple of examples to show that there's some evolution, or some evolution have happened between 2014 and 21. So I think schema-related libraries have seen the most steps in the evolution. For example, for us, it has meant from going from like something very hand-baked, no libraries, I code this myself kind of thing, via Cerberus, Marshmallow, to in-house solution, which is actually pretty similar what Pydantic offers nowadays. So you have others classes, and then when you instantiate them, you at the same time runtime type check that the fields are actually what you think they are. So that was around the time when Fast API started to kind of gain some popularity, and thus also Pydantic started to mature. So at the moment, I think it's, if you have a Fast API service, it's kind of obviously Pydantic, but we have plenty of Flask services which utilize this in-house, others-based custom solution. Another highlight, we are quite Mongo heavy. So we need to have a top-notch solution for Python plus Mongo. And Mongo engine didn't really offer that. It was surprisingly slow. Then we tried the other end. So basically the kind of database connector level of Mongo engine, which is PyMongo. That was maybe a bit too much on the low level side. So we ended up building something custom, which combines kind of PyMongo for the connecting to the database, and then others classes as a convenience layer for the developers. This is what we go with now, and it's quite performant, at least compared to Mongo engine. Yeah, just a couple of examples about the evolution of different kind of use cases and libraries that we use for them. Then there are some which haven't seen such evolution. One is Celery, that has been kind of trusted workhorse for many services for this kind of fire and forget kind of tasks. So for example, let's say receipt generation after you purchase something from Wolt. But yeah, what I want to say with this evolution of libraries is that we are not afraid of trying new things out if there is something that looks more promising than the current solution. So that sometimes means that the new thing looks shiny, but in reality, it's not production ready. Let's revert back to the old one. But we are not like holding back. Oh, I don't know about that new thing. I don't think we should try that out. But we are quite brave in trying things out and maybe failing fast or keeping them if they seem to be good fits. Then on the tooling side, yeah, of course, in the beginning, the tooling was quite non-existing. So hopefully at least some sort of requirements files. But nowadays we actually use Depend for pretty much all the projects. Although lately we have been a bit like we are not super happy with it, especially about its performance. So we might be going for Poetry for the new projects and then maybe migrate the older ones to use Poetry as well. Then like considering the landscape of Python overall, I think PyProject.toml seems to be the way to go. So that also supports Poetry. So if you pick one of these for your new projects, I would suggest to go with Poetry. We format our code with Black. Black basically does everything else except for everything related to imports. So for those, you actually need two libraries to get everything automated, iSort and Autoflake. And yeah, funny story about this Black. We needed to vote 1.5 years ago because, of course, people have opinions about the code style. So we had a voting like, should we let the computer decide how our code looks like, or should we continue like arguing about that during the PR reviews and such? Luckily, Black won, and we're still using it. And I think nowadays people would really miss it if we would take it out from them. Then we use some linters, Playgate and MyPy to name a few. Playgate is basically for all sorts of things, and MyPy is for type hints. And lastly, we usually tend to bake everything into a pre-commit so that it's easy to use locally. You don't have to set everything like individually, but you can just use pre-commit to run everything. All right, that's about it for the short history overview. And this brings us to the second part of the presentation. So we have grown from 2 developers to 80 something these days. So that means that we have learned quite a bunch of things on the way. And I'm kind of planning to share some of those learnings now. I try to keep things on a quite generic level, not specific to any like web framework or anything, but rather any Python project. Can I apply this kind of tip? Hopefully you can. What do I mean by at scale? I mean that you work in some sort of organization that has more than a handful of Python developers and maybe more than a dozen of Python projects. Then these start to become quite relevant, I think. And all of these are based on our real experiences with Python. The first one is use type hints extensively. This is super important if there are a number of people operating around the same code base. If you are not using type hints yet, I guarantee that if you take that route, there's no way back. Just to list a couple of benefits, you kind of get up-to-date documentation out of the box. If you have doc strings, they tend to get old. And I bet every single one of you have seen that. Then IDEs become very clever. That helps, for example, newcomers. They understand that what this foobar variable like actually means. And then I argue also that it kind of removes some testing needs. Because let's say 4 or 5 years ago, I saw plenty of tests in all sorts of projects which kind of content lines assert is instance something. You don't need that with MyPy. It's kind of implicitly tested when you just run MyPy or some other static type checker. I think there's at least PyWrite and can't remember the third one. But yeah, MyPy is the one that we use. And if you're not convinced yet, I bet you have seen some, at least once in production, attribute error, non-type object has no attribute, and then some attribute name. It basically comes when you encounter none when you don't expect none. I think this is one of the most searched stack traces from the Stack Overflow. With types and some static type checker, you don't get these sorts of surprises in production or in your staging environment either. Yep, then about maybe some practice. So we started using type hints around 2 years ago, and we took the challenge and introduced them in a project which contains around 100,000 lines of Python code. And when you start to use type hints for a, let's say, legacy project, this is kind of a good way to proceed. So strict by default, which kind of guarantees that all the new stuff that you write is well typed. And then for all the legacy stuff, you could explicitly mention that, all right, it's fine that this module doesn't have types. Then you can spend some Friday afternoons and get rid of these add types for some legacy modules, and your coworkers will most likely buy you beer or whatever you enjoy. And overall, if you're starting something new and shiny, so no legacy part, I would still suggest to go with a bit more stricter than defaults. For example, disallow untyped defs is one of my favorite flags. It basically says that you have to specify the type for every single thing that you have. And that's good. If you don't explicitly mention that, by default, MyPy is happy with non-typed things. That's why strict by default, loose by or looser by some specific legacy reasons. And related to that, it's not completely enough that you let MyPy handle the types of your code, because MyPy is kind of happy only within this area. Then if you get some data from some untrusted source, you definitely should check during runtime on the edge that it is what you expect. So for example, you get some JSON blob here, then you convert it to dict, you pull out some variable out of there, and you give it for some function which expects it to be int. But it can be anything. Dicts are one of the, let's say, biggest cancers considering type safety during runtime, excluding typed dictionaries. But plain dictionaries are bad. Modern Python should not have those in production code. That's just my humble opinion. Then the same goes for, let's say you call some external API, their shiny API documentation says that you get this kind of response back. Don't trust that. Check that and check the types of that before giving it to your business logic. Then one thing to note here is that if you do runtime type checking also in your business layers of your application, that's actually kind of slowing it down. There's always a performance penalty when you do some additional like type checking. So if you check it here, then on the next level and on the next level, you're basically duplicating the same check, so it's not providing any value. So it's enough to do the runtime type checking on the edges, and then let MyPy handle statically offline, not during runtime, that your logic doesn't kind of blow up. And Pydantic is one of the cool open source libraries that can help you, especially on the edges. But I would suggest to think carefully if you use Pydantic on all the layers. It might be that you're running Handbrake on because there's some performance penalty. All right. I think that's enough for the types. Then it's of course important that you have common set of tools defined and that you actually use them. I already mentioned the ones that we are using. That's not necessarily the same that you might be using, and that's okay. I think consistency here is the key because it's very easy for the developers to jump between the projects if they are familiar with the tooling in each of them. Then, of course, it's important to automate everything you can. I think that's part of the best practices you define, how you automate things. Like the people time is very expensive while we can get quite big computers quite cheaply. So let's focus on the real stuff in code reviews rather than arguing about like how should we format our code. Then what we have found out is that it's really valuable to provide some sort of containerized environment, especially for services. I'm not so sure about like libraries and like publishable packages, whether it makes sense to provide containerized environment for those. But it especially helps people who are not like so heavy Pythonists, so who don't want to create hundreds of virtual environments in their local machine. Also, if the stack of a service starts to get hairy and you run multiple services, it's very hard to run, let's say, 3 different versions of Postgres on your local machine. So some sort of containerization is preferred. And then once you have the kind of best practices set and defined, make it easy to multiply them. This goes pretty much hand in hand what Alex just told us. So Cookie Cutter is one great tool for bundling in all your best practices into a template. it's not only about the code and the config files, it's also about the CI, CD, those are like full life cycle of the thing that you're working on. Also, if you're starting to be on scale, let's say you have more than 10 projects, you start to see some sort of like needs for libraries, because you find yourself copy pasting some things for some project to another. Of course, if you can open source it, please do, but usually in a business context, you find use cases in which you have some sort of very, let's say in our case, very Wolt specific use case, but it's the same in 3 projects. Then it makes sense to already, when you spot the second one, it makes sense to extract that functionality into a library. There is, of course, some initial cost about that instead of copy pasting, but the payback time is often shorter than people might think, especially if you have the cookie cutter or whatever templating solution defines. So make sure that it's easy to spin up new cool stuff and it has the best practices bundled in. Last but not least, this is actually super important, but I think most of the people don't see it. So try to stay up to date with your dependencies. I believe most of us have been in a situation in which, let's say, some of our core dependencies pinned to some 1.x version. Then 2 years later, there's a feature available in that dependency which you would like to use. But that's only available in 3 points something, and you have the thing pinned in the 1 point something. All right, you say, cool, I'll remove the pinning and I'll use the greatest and latest. But then everything breaks. That core dependency had like 10 sub dependencies that you needed to upgrade as well. And well, hell broke loose and you need like a week to repair all the things. So to avoid this kind of situations, avoid pinning stuff. I think Poetry and Pipenv and what are the maybe some other cool tools for this exist. But for example, with Pipenv, we tend to use like plain star in the pip file so that it's not pinned to anything. We basically use always the latest. Even if there's a major version bump, we upgrade to that. And then we just trust our test suite to tell us whether it broke something or not. Maybe it's a bit different situation if you have kind of stable service and it's not maintained or actively developed. I think still it makes sense that you upgrade the dependencies actively, let's say once per week, for example. You could still have like some automation set up which creates you a PR, like here are the updated dependencies. Please merge if you don't see test failures. Because this, like even with the stale projects, helps you with the example I gave for the 2 years gone by, you had 1.x and the feature is available in 3 point something. Lastly, don't bundle the development dependencies in the deployable thing that you have. This, for example, makes your artifact that you're deploying smaller. And I think even more importantly, it's kind of shrinkens the attack surface for the hackers. Because of course you could have some vulnerability introduced via your development dependencies. And that's kind of, I would cry if I would see some attack against my development dependencies. Like, why are they even in my production image? All right, to recap. So if you want to take something with you from this whole meetup, I suggest that take one of these, bring it to your colleagues and discuss about this. Of course, you might disagree on something, but we can continue about that on the social gathering. I'm more than happy to discuss. So start using type hints if you haven't already. If you have, check your MyPy configs. I think the defaults are not strict enough. Make sure you play safe on the edges. Define a common set of tools and best practices, and make it easy to use them in new projects. And finally, stay up to date with your dependencies. Thank you. Hopefully you have some interesting questions. I haven't checked the Q&A during this presentation.
All good. I've been doing that for you. Fantastic, Xavier. And I have to say, I agree with so much of it. It's almost scary. I wish I could actually elaborate on all my rambling, but we don't really have much time to do so. So let's get. Oh, before we get into the questions,
yeah.
Don't you all go anywhere. After Jero's talk, I have a brief outro I want to give you guys, and then we have the social gathering, to which I will give the link at the very end of the presentation of this meetup. And then there we will have the chance to kind of like talk about pretty much anything, play some virtual games, just mingle. And it's important that we do that. Otherwise, it's not a true meetup. Right. So question number one here. How do you deal with services that require the requirements.txt file?
That require the requirements that you can migrate them to not require them. That would be my suggestion. Like, yeah, it's easier with services because that's the thing you own. You can decide how you handle the dependencies with that. It's different story when you have some dependency, which has pinned its dependency to something. And then you have some other dependency, which would use that same sub-dependency. You don't have that control over there. But with services, you can kind of decide yourself how you manage the things. So I would say migrate to Poetry.
Agreed. It actually makes it easy enough to just slurp a txt file like that and just get yourself to Poetry. I fought against Poetry. Yeah.
Just one note about this. So there's one project called Dephel, which allows you to move between different dependency systems. So for example, requirements.txt, Poetry, pipenv. So if you have a team which don't agree what sort of system to use, you could basically use every single one of those. Dephel was the name.
Yeah, good stuff. Next question, is the new Flask version 2.0 with async routes, is it going to impact your services?
Yeah, great question. I think we have some discussions ongoing, but I think the main blocker there is that it's not truly async. It's using I think it's developed by Django folks, the ASCII ref thing. So you would still use Whiskey kind of to run it, not ASCII. And there's some middleware which kind of turns the Whiskey stuff into async. So it won't be as performant as async frameworks out of the box. So I think it's kind of, yeah, I'm not sure what I think about it. And then there's also what's it called, Quart or something, which is basically the exact same API as Flask, but async version. So that's almost a drop-in replacement. So if you want to take that route, I suggest to look at that rather than using the async routes in the traditional Flask.
Yeah. Next question, two-parter. Did you have any problems with the slowness of MyPy checker on bigger projects? Is it part of your pull request pipeline?
Great question. So locally, pre-commit is awesome in a sense that it only runs MyPy for the change set that you're committing. So it's not like for the full project. And of course, locally you have that MyPy cache present as well. So that's not an issue. I think like most of my pre-commit stuff is done in less than 5 seconds. So that's not like handbrake on. Then on the CI, we run that in parallel with the test suite, and I would say the test suite usually takes longer than the MyPy run, so it hasn't been a problem.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Our test suite is humongous. I've never worked in a project with, was it over 12,000 tests? More? I can't remember.
Yeah, that's our biggest, 12,000 tests.
It's amazing. I didn't understand that before. And the second part of this question, and I'm very sorry, but we're not going to be able to get to the last two questions. So yeah, please jump on the social gathering and we'll cover them there. We only have a minute to go. Does having strict validation in place with MyPy also mean you need to type annotate not only function signatures, but all local variables like count, colon, int equals 0, which makes dev life a little bit annoying?
Yeah, good question. I actually thought about that when I said that you need to type everything. That should I clarify that you don't need to annotate the local variables because you don't. It's only like for the function arguments, return values, and then if MyPy cannot interpret for some variable, then you need to annotate that, but not for every single line. No.